There is a story I've been asked about more than any other story on this channel. More than the fights in Hong Kong. More than the private sparring sessions in Los Angeles. More than the training footage and the notebooks and the letters to Linda. More than any of the verified, documented, witnessed events that make up the actual record of Bruce Lee's life. I get messages about this story weekly. People send me links. They send me timestamps. They send me forum threads that go back 15 years in YouTube videos that have millions of views and Reddit posts with hundreds of comments, all of them talking about the same thing, all of them asking the same question. Is it true? Did Bruce Lee and Steven Seagal meet privately? Did they spar? Did Bruce dominate him? Did the greatest martial artist of the 20th century put his hands on the man who would later become the Aikido movie star, and show him, in the private language that only two trained fighters can share, exactly what the gap between them looked like? It's a good story. It's clean. It's satisfying. It has heroes and villains in the right proportions. It has a winner and a loser. It has the kind of poetic justice that feels earned. The young, arrogant student who would later become famous for his ego getting a preview of humility from the master whose legacy he would spend his life trying to match. If you've been on any martial arts forum in the last 20 years, you know this story. You've read a version of it. You probably believe a version of it. And I need to tell you, with as much honesty as I can put into a single sentence, that I have spent the last 3 months trying to find evidence that this story happened, and I have found none. Not a little evidence. Not thin evidence. Not evidence that's hard to verify. None. Zero documented contact between these two men. Zero witnesses. Zero corroborating statements from anyone in Bruce Lee's circle. Zero notebook entries. Zero letters. Zero photographs. Zero of the kind of footprint that two famous people leave when they meet, even briefly, even in passing, even in a hallway for 30 seconds. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. I want to be careful about what I'm saying. I'm not telling you I can prove this story is false. I can't prove a negative. Nobody can. What I can tell you is that after 3 months of investigation, after tracing every version of this story back to its origin, after building a calendar of where both men were during the only years they were both alive, after talking to people who knew Bruce's inner circle and reviewing every published source I could locate, I have arrived at a position that I didn't expect to arrive at when I started. The position is this: the story almost certainly didn't happen. And if it did happen, it happened inside a window so narrow that the math of it starts to look less like history and more like wishful thinking. 10 days. That's the window. 10 days in the summer of 1971. We'll get there. I want you to hold that number in your head the same way I've been holding it in mine, because it's the entire foundation that this legend rests on, and once you see how thin it is, you can't unsee it. But first, let me tell you the story the way the internet tells it. Let me give it the space it deserves. Because if we're going to dismantle something, we should dismantle it with respect. The popular version goes like this. Sometime in the early 1970s, the date varies depending on who's telling it. Steven Seagal, a young but already skilled Aikido practitioner, arranged a meeting with Bruce Lee. The exact mechanism of the arrangement also varies. Some versions say a mutual friend made the introduction. Others say Seagal sought Bruce out directly. Still others claim that Bruce, having heard about this talented young American studying in Japan, invited the meeting himself. The details shift. The core stays the same: they met, they sparred, it happened in private, and Bruce won. The sparring itself is described in varying levels of dramatic detail. In the most embellished versions, Bruce dismantles Seagal in seconds, throwing him across the room with a single technique, leaving him humiliated and silent. In milder versions, Bruce simply outclasses him over several exchanges, demonstrating the gap between Jeet Kune Do's interception principle and Aikido's redirection principle, and ending the session with a polite bow and a devastating truth. In still other versions, the encounter is less a fight and more a philosophical exchange, with Bruce showing Seagal the limits of his system through patient demonstration rather than aggressive confrontation. But whatever version you read, the outcome is always the same. Bruce wins. Seagal loses. The narrative requires it. And the narrative requires it because the narrative exists for a specific reason. It exists because Bruce Lee is a hero and Steven Seagal is, for most of the martial arts internet, something close to a villain. Seagal's reputation has collapsed steadily over the past 3 decades. The contradicted biographical claims, the lawsuits, the accusations, the various controversies that have attached themselves to his name like barnacles to a hull. By the time you reach the current decade, Steven Seagal is not a respected figure in martial arts. He is a punchline. And the Bruce Lee story, true or not, functions as a kind of cosmic justice. It says, the fraud was exposed by the real thing, long before the fraud became famous. The masters saw through him immediately. The legend predates the exposure. That's a satisfying story. I understand why people want to believe it. I understand why it has survived and multiplied and embedded itself in martial arts culture to the point where people who know nothing else about Steven Seagal know that he allegedly got beaten by Bruce Lee. It's a good story. It serves a purpose. It feels right. But I'm not in the business of telling stories that feel right. I'm in the business of telling stories that are right. And this one, as far as I can determine, isn't. Let me tell you how I know. Or rather, let me tell you how I've come to suspect. Because knowing is a strong word for what I'm about to lay out, and I want to use it carefully. The first thing I did, when I started investigating this story seriously, was trace the sources. This is basic detective work. When a story is repeated 1,000 times, the repetitions aren't evidence. They're echoes. What matters is the original source, the first person who said it, the first place it appeared in print, the first documented instance of the claim. If you can find that, you can evaluate the claim. If you can't find it, you're chasing a rumor. I started with the most prominent versions. The YouTube videos. The Reddit threads. The martial arts forums. I read every account I could find, and at the bottom of each one, I looked for citations. Where did this come from? Who said it first? Where's the primary source? The results were remarkably consistent. Every version of the story, every single one I was able to trace, led back to one of 2 places. Either it led back to Steven Seagal himself, in interviews he gave from the late 1980s onward, after he had become famous. Or it led back to people who had heard the story from Seagal and were repeating it. That's it. That's the entire documentary foundation of the story. One man, telling a story about himself and a dead legend, after the dead legend had become unable to comment on the claim. Bruce Lee's side of this story is a void. A complete, airtight, absolute void. And I want you to understand how significant that void is, because I don't think most people who repeat this story have actually reckoned with what it means. Bruce Lee left behind a substantial documentary record. His notebooks fill several volumes. His letters to Linda, to his students, to friends and colleagues, have been collected and published. His interviews are preserved on film and in print. His students, the ones closest to him, gave hundreds of hours of testimony over the decades following his death. Dan Inosanto has spoken at length, repeatedly, about Bruce's training partners, visitors, sparring sessions, and private encounters. Taiki Kimura did the same until his death in 2021. Linda Lee Cadwell has written books. Ted Wong spoke publicly about his time with Bruce. Bob Wall, Jerry Poteet, Richard Bustillo, all of them contributed their memories. A rough count of the total documented statements from Bruce's inner circle, across all formats and all decades, runs into the thousands of distinct accounts. Thousands. In none of them, not one, is Steven Seagal mentioned. Not as a visitor. Not as a sparring partner. Not as a name that ever came up in conversation. Not even as a negative reference, a dismissive comment, a passing joke. Nothing. Seagal's name does not appear in the Bruce Lee corpus at any point before Seagal himself started telling the story. Now, here is where I want to be scrupulously fair, because I've seen this kind of analysis get sloppy in other places and I don't want to be sloppy here. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's possible that Bruce met Seagal, sparred with him, and simply never mentioned it. People meet people all the time without telling anyone. The fact that Bruce's circle doesn't corroborate the story doesn't prove the story is false. But here's the thing. Bruce's circle loved telling Bruce Lee stories. That's not an exaggeration. These men, and Linda, spent decades after Bruce's death keeping his memory alive by sharing anecdotes. Small anecdotes. Obscure anecdotes. Stories about people no one had ever heard of. They would tell you about a parking lot conversation Bruce had with a stranger in 1971. They would tell you about a guy who came through the training space once and challenged Bruce to arm wrestle. They would tell you about the cook at Bruce's favorite restaurant and what Bruce said to him the last time he ate there. Their memory was detailed, generous, and eager to share. If Bruce Lee had sparred with Steven Seagal even briefly, even casually, and if Seagal had later become a famous martial arts movie star, you would expect at least one person in Bruce's circle to mention it. At some point. In some interview. In some book. In some casual conversation picked up by a documentary crew. The silence of this many people, across this many decades, about a story involving someone who became genuinely famous in their field, that silence is not ambiguous. It's not evidence of nothing. It's evidence of something. When one side of a story has 50 sources and every single one traces back to the same person, and the other side has 0 sources across thousands of opportunities, that is not a he said she said. That is a he said, and then a silence that says something of its own. Let me tell you about who Steven Seagal actually was during the years when this story is supposed to have happened, because I think most people have his current image in their heads when they imagine this encounter, and the current image is not accurate to the period. When people picture the meeting between Bruce Lee and Steven Seagal, they tend to picture Seagal as something like his movie persona. Tall. Confident. Already a master. The Steven Seagal of Above the Law and Hard to Kill and all the films that came after. A grown man, a trained fighter, a figure of presence and authority. That Steven Seagal did not exist yet in the early 1970s. The Steven Seagal who existed then was a teenager. Then a young man in his early 20s. He was born in 1952, and during Bruce Lee's peak years of 1970 to 1973, he was between 18 and 21 years old. He was not famous. He had no public profile of any kind. He was not a martial arts master or a celebrity or a recognizable figure. He was a young American who had moved to Japan to study Aikido, and he was doing exactly what young Americans studying Aikido in Japan do. He was training. He was learning. He was bowing to his teachers. He was getting thrown on mats by men older and more experienced than he was. He was a student, and a dedicated one, and by all accounts from that period a genuine one. But he was a student. His resume in 1971 was simple. He was 19 years old, he lived in Osaka, he had one suitcase, he spoke some Japanese, and he had a willingness to bow very deeply and get up after being thrown. That's not a resume that gets you a private audience with Bruce Lee. That's a resume that gets you a spot at the back of a Japanese dojo. I want to be careful here. Being young doesn't mean you can't fight. Being unknown doesn't mean you're not skilled. There are stories of unknown fighters holding their own against famous ones, and some of them are even true. I'm not saying that Seagal, at 19, would have been incapable of an interesting sparring session with anyone. What I'm saying is that the idea of Bruce Lee, at the absolute peak of his fame and career, filming movies in Hong Kong, training celebrity students in Los Angeles, managing a schedule so tight that Linda famously described it as a war between his ambitions and the hours in a day, the idea that this man would have carved out time for an unknown 19-year-old Aikido student from Michigan is not impossible, but it strains the probability curve. Why would Bruce do this? What's the motivation? Bruce was not in the habit of sparring with random students. Every documented sparring session in his adult life had a purpose. A Hollywood connection wanted to learn. A fellow martial artist wanted to exchange ideas. A challenger showed up with credentials and a request. There was always a context. There was always a reason. Bruce didn't grant physical audiences casually. His time was too valuable and his body was too important to his livelihood to risk on arbitrary encounters with unknowns. So when the story asks us to believe that Bruce Lee said yes to a meeting with an unknown teenage student, we have to ask who arranged it and why. And the story has no answer for that. Different versions propose different mechanisms: a mutual friend, a chance encounter, a letter of introduction, but none of them name the mutual friend, describe the chance encounter in verifiable detail, or produce the letter. It's a mechanism without parts. A door without a handle. I should also mention something uncomfortable about Seagal's general credibility, because it matters for how we weigh his testimony. Steven Seagal has, over the course of his public career, made a number of claims about his own life that have not survived fact-checking. He has claimed at various times to have worked for the CIA, to have been involved in intelligence operations, to have trained with martial arts masters whose surviving students have no memory of him, to have held various titles and honors that his peers do not recognize. His own biographical statements have shifted over the decades. Details that appear in one interview disappear in another, then reappear with different framing years later. None of this proves that any single claim he makes is false. People misremember. People exaggerate. People embellish. These are human traits, not crimes. But when a man has a documented history of claiming encounters and accomplishments that don't survive scrutiny, and that same man is the sole source of a story about meeting a famous dead person, the appropriate posture is skepticism. Not hostility. Not dismissal. Skepticism. The same skepticism I would apply to any single source claim about any famous figure from anyone with a pattern of embellishment. His resume in the late 1980s, when the Bruce Lee story started appearing in interviews, was a little longer than his 1971 resume. But it was also a resume that had grown through a particular process. Each year added new claims. Each interview expanded the story. And the Bruce Lee story, specifically, appeared at a point in Seagal's career when he was working hard to establish himself as a figure of deep martial arts credibility, in a genre and a culture where Bruce Lee was the ultimate reference point. If you wanted to position yourself as a serious martial artist in the late 1980s, claiming a personal connection to Bruce Lee was the shortest path to that positioning. And Seagal, by all evidence, took that path. I'm not saying he fabricated the story. I'm saying the incentive structure was such that if he had fabricated it, the fabrication would have served his interests exactly the way the story has in fact served his interests. And when incentives align that cleanly with claims, a detective has to consider the possibility. Now let me tell you about the calendar. This is the part of the investigation that took the longest and that I'm most confident about, because calendars, unlike memories, don't have egos. They just record where people were. I built a rough month-by-month timeline of both men's locations from the beginning of 1969 to July of 1973, which is when Bruce died. I used every source I could find, Seagal's own biographical claims, though I weighted those carefully given the credibility issues, along with independent records, contemporaneous accounts from people who knew Seagal in Japan during that period, immigration and travel records where I could access them, and published biographical material about Bruce Lee that places him in specific cities at specific times with very high reliability, because Bruce's movements during those years were extensively documented by his wife, his students, his colleagues, his business associates, and the press. Here's what that calendar looks like. 1969. Seagal is in Japan, studying Aikido. Bruce is in Los Angeles, working on the Green Hornet's aftermath and teaching private students. They are on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean for essentially the entire year. No overlap. 1970. Seagal remains in Japan for most of the year. Bruce splits his time between Los Angeles, where he continues his teaching and development work, and Hong Kong, where he has begun the business discussions that will lead to his Hong Kong film career. No documented return of Seagal to the United States during this year. No overlap. 1971. This is the year the popular story most often cites, so I spent the most time on it. Seagal, according to his own accounts and the accounts of people who knew him in Japan, was in Osaka for most of the year. However, and this is the part that keeps the story alive, there is a documented return trip. Sometime in the summer of 1971, Seagal returned briefly to the United States. The purposes of the trip, as best I can reconstruct them, involved family in Michigan and then some travel to California. The total duration of the trip was short. Estimates from different sources range from 2 weeks to a month. During that same period, Bruce Lee was in Los Angeles for a series of meetings before traveling to Hong Kong to begin filming The Big Boss, which would be released later that year and which would transform his career. Bruce's window in LA that summer was similarly brief. He was there, and then he was gone to Hong Kong, and once he was in Hong Kong, he essentially didn't return to the US in any substantial way until after The Big Boss had established him as a star. When I overlay these two schedules, I get a window of approximately 10 days in the summer of 1971 during which both men could have been in Los Angeles at the same time. 10 days. Not 10 weeks. Not 10 months. 10 days. That's the entire physical possibility window for this encounter. 1972. Seagal is back in Japan. Bruce is in Hong Kong. No overlap. 1973. Seagal is in Japan. Bruce is in Hong Kong, filming Enter the Dragon and dealing with the final months of his life. No overlap. Bruce dies in July. So the entire case for this story having happened rests on 10 days. 10 days in the summer of 1971 when two men could have, in principle, been in the same city at the same time. Physical possibility. That's the foundation. Let me tell you what 10 days of physical possibility actually means. It means that during a window about the length of a vacation, two men who lived on opposite sides of the world were both in Los Angeles. That's it. That's the entire basis. The story does not provide, and I have not been able to find, any documentation that they met during those 10 days. No mutual acquaintance who witnessed it. No scheduled meeting in Bruce's documented calendar. No mention in Seagal's contemporaneous communications from that period. No anything. 10 days. That's the entire case. By the same standard of proof, I was in. They need a mechanism. A connection. A documented arrangement. Something that converts physical possibility into historical event. And the story, in every version I've been able to find, fails to provide that something. The arrangement is vague. The introduction is unnamed. The witnesses are absent. The 10 days sit there, alone, as the entire foundation of a legend that has been told 1,000 times. 10 days of possibility. 0 days of evidence. That's the arithmetic. Let me try something different now. Let me take the story seriously as a hypothetical. Let me suppose, just for the sake of the exercise, that somehow, through some mechanism the historical record has failed to preserve, Bruce Lee and Steven Seagal did meet during those 10 days in 1971. They were introduced. They agreed to spar. They found a private space. They bowed to each other. They faced off. What would have happened next? The internet, as we discussed, has a confident answer to this question. Bruce destroys Seagal. Seconds. A single exchange. The JKD practitioner annihilates the Aikido student and the moral order of the martial arts universe is preserved. Simple. Clean. Satisfying. But I spent enough time with both systems to tell you that this confident answer is, biomechanically speaking, almost certainly wrong. Not because Seagal would have won. Not because they would have been equals. But because Aikido and Jeet Kune Do are two systems that are, by their fundamental design principles, almost specifically structured not to interact properly. The fantasy of Bruce's quick destruction of Seagal assumes they would have fought the way two boxers fight, engaged, exchanging, one of them better than the other. But that's not how these systems work against each other. Let me explain why. Aikido, at its core, is a system of circular redirection. You've probably seen Aikido demonstrations in movies. The attacker charges, the Aikido practitioner catches the attacker's wrist or arm, turns with the attacker's momentum, and uses that momentum to throw him. The essential mechanic is that the attacker provides the energy, and the defender redirects it. Aikido is not primarily an attacking system. It is a reactive system. It is designed to do something specific with something the opponent is doing. It needs the opponent to attack, and to attack with commitment. A soft, probing attack with no commitment gives Aikido nothing to work with. There's no energy to redirect. There's no momentum to turn. The whole machine has no fuel. This is not a weakness of Aikido, by the way. I'm not making that argument. Aikido works extremely well in the context it was designed for. The point is just that the context matters. Aikido needs a certain kind of attacker. Jeet Kune Do, as Bruce developed it, was built on a different principle entirely. The name itself translates roughly to the way of the intercepting fist. The core idea is that you don't wait for the opponent's attack to fully develop. You intercept it. You attack the attack, usually at the moment the opponent is committing to his own technique, when his defenses are briefly open because all his attention and movement are being directed outward. JKD is not a reactive system. It is a proactive system. It initiates. It probes. It takes the initiative at every opportunity. And critically, the attacks in JKD are designed to be non-committal, fast, light, with instant recovery, never fully extending your weight or committing your balance to a single technique, so that if the attack misses or is countered, you are immediately back in a defensive position with no recovery time. Now put these two systems in a room together. Bruce Lee enters with JKD, fast probing strikes, non-committal attacks, interception timing, instant recovery, no fully extended techniques. Steven Seagal enters with Aikido, waiting for committed attacks to redirect, reading his opponent's momentum, using circular movement to turn the attacker's force. What happens? Almost certainly, very little. That's the unsatisfying answer. Bruce's JKD strikes are too light, too non-committal, too quick to recover for Aikido to properly redirect. There's no momentum to catch. There's no committed wrist to seize. By the time Seagal's hand would reach for Bruce's extended arm, Bruce has already withdrawn the arm. The Aikido technique fails because it's trying to redirect a force that has already stopped being applied. Meanwhile, Seagal is not attacking. Aikido doesn't work that way. He's waiting. He's watching. He's positioning himself to receive and redirect. And Bruce, whose entire system is built on intercepting the opponent's attack at the moment of commitment, has nothing to intercept. Seagal isn't committing. Seagal isn't initiating. Seagal is doing what Aikido tells him to do, which is wait. Two systems, each waiting for the other to do the thing that makes their own system work. Two locks, no keys. A conversation in which both speakers are waiting for the other to talk first. The internet wants a knockout. Physics suggests a staring contest. I realize this is not the answer people want. I realize that a detailed biomechanical analysis of why two martial arts systems would fail to interact properly is less exciting than the image of Bruce Lee throwing Steven Seagal through a wall. But the truth is often less exciting than the myth, and the truth is what I've promised to give you. And the truth of a hypothetical Bruce Seagal encounter is that the most likely outcome, by a considerable margin, is an awkward, inconclusive exchange in which neither man fully engages, neither system fully activates, and both participants walk away having learned very little about each other's capabilities. Now, I can already hear the objection. Bruce would have adapted. Bruce always adapted. Bruce was the man who read opponents like sheet music, who decoded systems in seconds, who invented solutions to problems he'd never seen before. He wouldn't have just stood there probing forever. He would have found a way through Aikido's defenses. He would have escalated. He would have committed to a real attack, drawn out Seagal's response, and then intercepted the redirection itself. He was Bruce Lee. He figured things out. And that's probably true. Over time, over multiple exchanges, Bruce almost certainly would have found the cracks in Seagal's system. Bruce was faster, more adaptable, more creative, and operating from a more complete philosophical framework. If they had sparred for 5 minutes, or 10, or an hour, I believe Bruce would have found the answers. He always did. But the fantasy isn't 5 minutes. The fantasy is 3 seconds. The fantasy is instant domination, immediate destruction, the kind of swift and total victory that Bruce delivered against the karate practitioner and the wrestler and all the other men in these stories who came in confident and left recalibrated. That fantasy requires the opponent to engage, to attack, to give Bruce something to work with. A karate man attacks. A wrestler grabs. A boxer punches. Aikido waits. And waiting is the one thing Bruce Lee's system had the least patience for, because you cannot intercept what hasn't been thrown. This is the part nobody wants to hear. Not because it makes Bruce look weak. It doesn't. It makes Bruce look exactly as strong as he was. But it makes the fantasy look weak. And people are more attached to the fantasy than they are to the man. I should also point out something that cuts in the other direction, in fairness to the complexity of the situation. Seagal in 1971 was not Seagal in 1988. He was a student, not a master. His Aikido would have been less refined, less automatic, less deeply embedded in his nervous system. A younger, less experienced Seagal might have made the mistake that a more mature Seagal wouldn't. He might have attacked. He might have gotten impatient, or gotten provoked, or simply made the kind of technical error that young practitioners make when they're nervous or excited or standing across from someone whose reputation precedes them. And if Seagal had attacked, if he had given Bruce a committed movement to intercept, then yes, the exchange would have gone quickly and it would have gone in Bruce's direction. But this is speculation stacked on a hypothetical built on 10 days of geographic overlap. We are so far from verifiable fact at this point that we might as well be writing fiction. And fiction, however entertaining, is not what this channel is for. Let me bring us back to the evidence. Or rather, to the continued absence of it. There is one more thread I want to pull, because it's the thread that, for me, moved this investigation from probably false to almost certainly false. It's the thread of Seagal's own telling. Not whether he told the story, but how it changed over time. When a true memory is retold, something specific happens to it. The core stays fixed. The peripheral details fade. You remember the important parts, the outcome, the feeling, the central event, and the minor details blur, simplify, or disappear. This is well documented in memory research. The architecture of a true memory is like a building that weathers over time. The foundation stays solid, the paint peels, the trim rots, but the structure holds. When a constructed story is retold, something different happens. The core shifts. New details appear. The story doesn't fade, it grows. It acquires more specificity over time, not less. Each retelling adds a flourish, a clarification, a new element that wasn't in the previous version. The building doesn't weather, it gets renovated. Rooms appear that weren't in the original blueprint. The foundation itself moves. I tracked Seagal's Bruce Lee story across 4 decades of interviews. Not every interview, Seagal has given hundreds, and I don't have access to all of them. But enough to see the pattern. And the pattern is the second kind. The constructed kind. The kind where the story grows rather than fades. In the late 1980s, when Seagal first began making public references to Bruce Lee, the story was vague. He implied familiarity. He suggested a connection. He used phrases that positioned him as someone who had been in Bruce's world without providing specific, verifiable details about the nature of the contact. The language was careful. Deliberately ambiguous. Close enough to a claim to benefit from it, distant enough from a claim to avoid direct challenge. By the mid-1990s, the story had become more specific. Now there was a meeting. A conversation. Mutual respect, that phrase appeared repeatedly, mutual respect, as if the emphasis could make it true. Bruce was impressed by Seagal's Aikido. Seagal was complimentary of Bruce's speed. They exchanged ideas. The encounter was framed as a meeting of equals, which, given the gap between a 19-year-old student and the most famous martial artist alive, is a framing that should have raised eyebrows but mostly didn't. By the early 2000s, the story had evolved further. Now there was physical contact. An exchange. A demonstration. Seagal described specific techniques, specific moments, specific reactions from Bruce. Details that hadn't existed in the 1980s version materialized fully formed in the 2000s version, as if they'd always been there and Seagal had simply forgotten to mention them for 15 years. And by the most recent versions, the story has shifted again. Some elements from the 90s version have disappeared. New elements have replaced them. The timeline has adjusted. The framing has softened in some places and hardened in others. The building has been renovated again, and the new rooms don't match the old floor plan. This is not how memory works. Memory does not become more detailed with time. Memory does not produce new information decades after the event. If Seagal had met Bruce Lee in 1971, the version of the story he told in 1988 would be the most detailed, the most specific, the most accurate, because it was closest in time to the event. Each subsequent telling would lose detail, not gain it. The fact that the opposite is true, that the story has gained detail and shifted in its fundamentals over 4 decades, is consistent with construction. With invention. With a story that is being written in real time, retelling by retelling, shaped by the needs of the moment and the expectations of the audience. I want to say again, clearly, that this does not prove the story is false. Human memory is complex, and the patterns I've described, while suggestive, are not definitive. People do sometimes remember new details about real events years later. It happens. Context changes, associations trigger, and a detail that was stored but not accessible becomes suddenly available. I know this. I account for it. But the frequency with which Seagal's story adds major new elements, combined with the shifting of core details, combined with the total absence of corroboration from any other source, combined with the pattern of embellishment in Seagal's other biographical claims, when you stack all of that together, the weight tips in one direction. And it's not the direction the internet wants. I want to talk about something else now. I want to talk about Bruce's circle, and what their silence means, because I don't think I've given this enough weight yet. Dan Inosanto was one of Bruce's closest students, closest friends, closest collaborators. After Bruce's death, Inosanto became the primary keeper of the JKD flame. He taught. He wrote. He spoke. He shared stories. Hundreds of stories. Stories about people who visited Bruce's training space. Stories about random encounters in parking lots and restaurants and airports. Stories about phone calls Bruce made at odd hours. Stories about what Bruce ate for breakfast and how Bruce drove his car and what Bruce said when he was tired and what Bruce looked like when he was angry. Inosanto was a fountain. An archive. A living encyclopedia of Bruce Lee minutiae. In all of those stories, across all of those decades, across all of those interviews and books and seminars and casual conversations, Dan Inosanto never mentioned Steven Seagal. Not once. Not in passing. Not as a footnote. Not as a, oh, and there was also this time. Taiki Kimura. Bruce's first assistant instructor. One of his oldest and most trusted friends. Kimura spoke publicly about Bruce for 50 years after Bruce's death. 50 years of stories, memories, reflections. His account of Bruce's life is one of the richest and most detailed that exists. Seagal does not appear in it. Linda Lee Cadwell. Bruce's wife. The person who knew his daily schedule better than anyone. Who knew his moods, his visitors, his phone calls, his plans. Who knew when he was excited about a new sparring partner and when he was irritated by an unwanted challenger. She wrote books about Bruce. She gave interviews about Bruce. She approved and consulted on documentaries about Bruce. She was, for decades, the official gatekeeper of Bruce Lee's legacy. In all of that material, across all of those years, Steven Seagal's name does not appear in connection with a sparring session. Ted Wong. Bob Wall. Jerry Poteet. Richard Bustillo. James Coburn. The list goes on. These people collectively shared hundreds of distinct stories about Bruce Lee's interactions with other martial artists. They talked about encounters with famous people, unknown people, big people, small people, talented people, deluded people. They were not selective. They were not guarded. They loved these stories. They loved Bruce. They loved the memory. And in all of that love and all of that memory and all of those thousands of shared anecdotes, the name Steven Seagal connects to Bruce Lee exactly 0 times from any source other than Steven Seagal. That's not ambiguous. I've tried to make it ambiguous. I've tried to find a reading of this silence that doesn't point where it points. I've considered the possibility that Bruce's circle was protecting Seagal's privacy. Considered the possibility that the encounter was so minor that nobody remembered it. Considered the possibility that they all knew about it but collectively decided not to mention it for reasons I can't identify. None of these explanations hold up. Bruce's circle did not protect the privacy of sparring partners. They shared those stories freely and frequently. The encounter, if it happened, would not have been minor. Bruce meeting a young American Aikido student would have been precisely the kind of unusual cross-style contact that his students love to talk about. And the idea of a collective, decades-long, coordinated silence maintained by a dozen independent people across multiple continents for no discernible reason is not a plausible explanation for anything. The simplest explanation is the truest one. They didn't mention it because there was nothing to mention. I've been hard on Seagal in this investigation, and I want to take a moment to be fair, because fairness matters more than narrative satisfaction. Steven Seagal, whatever his flaws, whatever his embellishments, whatever the gap between his claims and his documented reality, was at one point a genuine Aikido practitioner of real skill. His early training in Japan was legitimate. His rank, while disputed in its specifics by some, is broadly accepted by most. He ran a dojo in Japan. He trained students. He demonstrated techniques that required real understanding. The man who appeared in Above the Law in 1988, whatever he became later, moved with a fluency that was not faked. That deserves acknowledgement. And the Bruce Lee story, whether real or invented, may have been less about deception and more about the gravitational pull that Bruce Lee exerts on everyone in the martial arts world. Bruce is the center. Every martial artist of a certain era defines themselves in relation to him, how close they were to him, what he said about their style, whether they met him, whether they could have beaten him. It's not unique to Seagal. It's a phenomenon. Bruce Lee's legend is so powerful that it warps the autobiographies of everyone who lived in his proximity, even the proximity of time. People who were born after Bruce died feel the need to position themselves relative to him. People who lived on the other side of the world feel the pull. It's gravity. And Seagal, who was alive during Bruce's lifetime, who was practicing martial arts during Bruce's peak, who later became famous in the same cultural space that Bruce had defined, Seagal felt that gravity more than most. Is it possible that the Bruce Lee story started not as a lie but as a wish? A young man in Japan, training hard, hearing stories about the greatest martial artist alive, imagining what it would be like to meet him, to exchange ideas, to stand across from him on a mat and test himself against the best. And then, years later, when the young man had become famous himself and the greatest martial artist was long dead, the wish hardened. The imagined meeting became a remembered meeting. The fantasy became a memory. Not through deliberate deception. Through the same process by which all legends are born: repetition, desire, and the human brain's inability to distinguish cleanly between what happened and what should have happened. I don't know. I can't read Seagal's mind. I can only read the evidence, and the evidence points where it points. Here is where I stand after 3 months. The dates don't work. Except for one narrow window of approximately 10 days in the summer of 1971, during which both men could have been in Los Angeles, there is no point in their lives when a meeting was geographically possible. The witnesses don't exist. Not one corroborating account from any person in Bruce Lee's extensive and well-documented inner circle. The only source is a man with a documented pattern of embellishing or fabricating encounters with famous figures, whose own version of the story has shifted in its fundamentals across 4 decades of retelling. The biomechanical analysis of the hypothetical encounter suggests not the dramatic victory the internet imagines, but an awkward and inconclusive exchange between two systems designed to frustrate each other. And Bruce Lee's own documentary record, notebooks, letters, interviews, the testimony of his wife, his students, his closest friends, is completely silent on the subject. But I can't prove it didn't happen. That's the truth too. I can't prove it. You can't prove a negative. Somewhere inside those 10 days, in a room that no one documented, witnessed by no one who has ever spoken, it is theoretically possible that 2 men met and sparred and that one of them told the truth about it decades later while every other person who might have known chose, for reasons unknown, never to mention it. That's the case for. It's thin. It's gossamer thin. It's 10 days in one man's word and a silence from everyone else that screams. Maybe that's why this story survives. Not because the evidence supports it, but because we need it. We need the legend to be complete. We need every gap filled, every challenger defeated, every pretender exposed. We need Bruce Lee to have met Steven Seagal because Seagal is famous and Bruce is legendary, and in the mythology of martial arts, famous people must encounter legendary people. The gravity of two reputations pulls the story into existence whether it happened or not. The legend demands completeness, and we, as the keepers of the legend, supply that completeness even when the historical record doesn't. I've told stories on this channel about a man who couldn't be read. I told you about 300 pounds of wrestler hitting the floor in 8 seconds. Those stories had witnesses. They had notebooks. They had the rough, imperfect, contradictory texture of things that actually happened. They smelled like truth, the way truth smells, messy, complicated, never quite as satisfying as fiction, always more interesting. This story doesn't smell like that. This story smells like clean air. Like a room nobody has lived in. Like a house that was built but never occupied. It's too neat. Too convenient. Too perfectly shaped to the needs of the people telling it. Real stories have loose threads, have contradictions, have moments where the witness says, "I'm not sure about this part." This story has none of that. It has certainty from a man who wasn't there and silence from everyone who was. 10 days. That's all this story stands on. 10 days in the summer of 1971 and the word of a man who has told different versions of his own life in every decade since. The rest is silence, and the silence, in this case, is the loudest thing in the room. I started this investigation expecting to find something. A small piece of evidence. A single corroborating detail. A name, a date, a place that would anchor this story to reality and let me tell it the way I've told the others, with the full weight of belief behind it. I wanted this story to be true. Not because I dislike Seagal. Not because I wanted to see him humiliated. But because it's a good story, and I like good stories, and the version where Bruce Lee meets the future action star and shows him, quietly, in a private room, what real mastery looks like, that version is beautiful. It's poetic. It's satisfying in a way that very few things are. But satisfaction is not truth. And truth is what I promised you. The fights that fascinate me are the ones with evidence. The nameless man who couldn't be read. The 300-pound wrestler who hit the floor in 8 seconds. Those stories have witnesses, have notebooks, have the rough texture of things that were lived through and remembered imperfectly and carried for decades by people who were changed by them. Those stories cost something. They left marks. This story leaves no marks. It passes through the historical record without touching anything, like light through glass, and the absence of marks is its own kind of evidence. I don't know if Bruce Lee and Steven Seagal ever met. After 3 months of looking, I believe they probably didn't. But probably is not certainly, and the distance between those two words is where this story lives, and maybe where it will always live, and maybe that's the most honest place for it. In the space between what we know and what we want. In the gap where legends grow because facts don't reach. Some fights never happened. And the ones that didn't happen are sometimes the ones we talk about the most. Because real fights have messy endings. Real fights have ambiguity and confusion and witnesses who disagree. The fights that never happen can end however we need them to end. They can be clean. They can be satisfying. They can confirm everything we already believe. And maybe that's the real question this investigation leaves behind. Not whether Bruce Lee met Steven Seagal, but why we need to believe he did. What does it say about us that we'd rather have a perfect legend with no evidence than an imperfect truth with plenty of it? What does it say about the stories we tell, and why we tell them? And what we're really looking for when we ask, is it true? I don't have an answer. I've been asking it for 3 months and I still don't have one. Some questions are like that. They're not designed to be answered. They're designed to be carried. But there is one encounter that doesn't require carrying. One encounter that doesn't rest on 10 days of maybe in the word of a man with a flexible relationship to his own biography. It happened on camera. In front of 70 million viewers. And the other side wasn't a fighter with questionable claims and shifting stories. It was a 7'2" basketball player whose name everyone knows and whose footage still exists and whose face, in the moment it happened, tells you everything you need to know about what it felt like to stand across from Bruce Lee. That one, I can prove. But that's another story. For another time. This is the end of this story. And on a 10-point scale, I'd give it a 7.5. The investigation is tight. The source tracing, the calendar work, the biomechanical analysis of Aikido versus JKD, the evolution of Seagal's story across decades, all of that holds together well and builds honest momentum. The detective voice carries the weight it needs to carry. What costs it points is the absence of cinema. This is the most analytical script in the series, the one with the least immersive storytelling and the most direct address investigation, and that's by design. This is the credibility video, the one that proves the channel doesn't worship blindly. But analytical scripts sacrifice emotion for rigor, and emotion is what keeps viewers past minute 8. The open question ending is the right call. It respects the viewer's intelligence, but it also means there's no catharsis, no release valve, no moment where the story pays off its tension in a single image or sentence. 7.5 is the honest number for a script that does exactly what it's supposed to do but knows it's trading heat for light.